Now, many of you probably have heard of Roanoke. You may have even been to the area where Roanoke was first established because it's in the Outer Banks. It's the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And Roanoke was a colony that was established by Sir Walter Raleigh in 1585. Now, Sir Walter Raleigh was a very good friend of Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth gave Walter Raleigh the opportunity to come over here and establish a colony that was off the coast of North Carolina. Now, the people that Walter Raleigh brought with him were all men. That was who came to this colony. Everyone came to this area, and if you've ever been to this area, it's beautiful, but if you're trying to establish a colony there, it's really not the best place to do it. You've ever been to the Outer Banks? It's a lot of sand. There are lots of bugs. It's kind of marshy and damp. It is not really the best place to try to establish a colony. And so when they did this, they tried to establish it the first time, they starved to death. And some of them died, others of them just decided that it was not worth their time, and so they were going to abandon the colony. So shortly after getting there, they abandoned the colony and went back to England. Now, this was not the only attempt to settle Roanoke. A second attempt happened to settle Roanoke in 1590. This second attempt was led by John White. Now, John White brought not just men this time, but he decided that Roanoke would be a family settlement. And when he realized that he needed more supplies and more food to help this family settlement establish, he and some others went back to England to get some supplies. Now, this is a very tricky time for people to get to and from the colonies in England, because at this time England was wrapped up in a war, and when John White was in England, he got stuck in England with his supplies and wasn't able to get back. In fact, he wasn't able to get back for quite some time, and by the time he got back to look for the Roanoke settlement, the settlement had disappeared. There was nobody in sight. Everything was there, the houses were there, the basic parts of the settlement were there, but no people were there, and really no remnants of people living there for much time at all was left. And the only thing that was left was a message carved into a tree that said Croatoan. Now, there are a couple different theories what this means. The Croatoans were a group of Indians that were nearby that had helped them originally, but then left them after some time. And so there's never been really any explanation as to why Croatoan was carved into this tree. Now, one explanation was that the Croatoan Indians or another group of Indians came and attacked the settlement. For whatever reason, they just decided that they didn't want to have the settlement here, and they massacred the people that were there and took the ones that were still alive to live with them. Now, there's a possibility of this because later on, as more successful settlements were established, they did find some natives with blue eyes throughout the coastal area of North Carolina, and therefore that's somewhat of a valid possibility. But there was no evidence of any bloodshed, no evidence of a battle in the settlement, so we can't really say for sure that this is the case. Another possibility was that the people tried to leave the island settlement because they were starving and being less successful than the original colony there, and so tried to build a raft, and in searching for another place to settle, they crashed among the rocks or got lost at sea and were never seen again. Now, we don't have any evidence of this, but this also is a distinct possibility. The third theory about the Roanoke colony was that the people just disappeared because they were abducted by aliens. Now, this is a theory that's put out there by a few people, but probably not the most reliable theory that exists. Now, the next settlement we're going to talk about is the Jamestown colony. Now, Jamestown was successful, although it really wasn't very successful at first. In 1606, Englishmen received a charter from James I to settle this area in the New World. And they received that charter, and by doing so, they formed what was called a joint stock company. So basically what that was is you had some people that were willing to settle in this area, and other people that just wanted to make money off this settlement, and so they put money in stocks, and they wanted to receive their money back. But most of the people that were involved in this joint stock company were people that wanted to make money but were willing to go to the colonies because they saw this as a grand adventure, something that was kind of exciting. But the problem was most of these people that were setting sail on this grand adventure were rather wealthy people from England, and they had never really done anything like this before. And so when they get there, they are not at all prepared for what they needed to do, which was work. They didn't know how to farm, they didn't know how to cook, they didn't know how to sew, they didn't know how to do any of the things that it took to survive, because essentially they were people in England that were landed aristocrats, people that owned land and rented that land to make money, but really didn't know how to do anything else. So they pretty much were unsuccessful in their attempts to settle this colony. And also, if you've ever been to the Jamestown area, it's really not a very good place to create a settlement. It was pretty swamp-like. There was sandy soil, similarly to Roanoke, not a good place necessarily to plant any crops, or at least sustainable crops that you could use to eat. And there was no real leader in this colony. All these guys were rich, well-off men, and they all kind of fought for the leadership position, which ended up not really helping at all. It didn't really give them the opportunity to be successful. So the king, realizing that this was going to not be a successful colony if he didn't do something about it, decided that he was going to send somebody to help. And so in Jamestown, he decided that he was going to send somebody to kind of rile up the people, to get them motivated, and he sent John Smith. Now, obviously, a lot of you have seen Pocahontas, and you immediately think of this John Smith. Now, this is not the John Smith of reality. This is the John Smith of Disney. The real John Smith is this guy. Quite a bit of difference. Now, the John Smith from Disney can sing a nice song and can, look tough and strong, but the real John Smith was actually tough. He came in and told the colonists in Jamestown, if you don't work, you don't eat. Basically, keeping the food to himself and making sure that people contributed to the colony. Now, another myth that is perpetuated by Disney is that John Smith and Pocahontas had a romantic relationship. That's not true either, but Pocahontas did have a relationship with one of the settlers in Jamestown, but in fact, it was a man named John Rolfe. So, if you're ever watching Pocahontas, you may want to note that. Now, John Smith, when he first came to the colonies, realized that he needed to have some good relations with the natives. Now, this worked at first, but then the natives kind of went back and forth and they had some issues. And at one point, the natives attacked John Smith and the settlers of Jamestown, and he got injured. So John Smith had to go back to England. So when John Smith left for England, there was a downturn in the Jamestown colony again. Now at this point, you get John Rolfe. This is when he comes onto the scene. When John Rolfe comes onto the scene, he reclaims some relationship with the with the natives, and they introduce him to a plant. And that plant is tobacco. The British discovered tobacco. They realized that it was an easy plant to grow, and in fact it was very popular. It was popular among the colonists and became very popular among the people in England. Eventually, pretty much everybody in England was clamoring for this weed, and they wanted to send it to England. And so they grew it, and they sent it to England, and that is what saved the Jamestown colony. It was tobacco. John Smith helped, but certainly without tobacco, there would not have been a successful Jamestown colony. In fact, tobacco at one point became so popular that they tilled up the streets of Jamestown and were growing it even in the streets. So this was their success. It was a cash crop. It encouraged more settlement in this area, more growth of tobacco, and it created the tobacco industry. Now, the last colony we're going to talk about today is the Plymouth colony. Now, the Plymouth colony was settled by the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were a group of separatists, people that wanted to break away from the church, not just change the Church of England, but completely separate from it, because they were being persecuted by the king. They actually moved to the Netherlands first, and they were there for a little while, but they were disturbed by the Dutchification of their culture. So they decided to move back to England. The king said, no, we already kicked you out of here once, so why don't you move to the colonies? And so he gave them what was at the time called a proprietary colony, where they were able to do what they wanted with the land they were given. So in 1620, about 100 pilgrims got on a boat called the Mayflower, and they wanted to start a settlement free from the persecution from the King of England. When they discovered that they were close to land, they realized that there was really no way for them to govern this new group of people. And so they sat down and they created what was called the Mayflower Compact. All the church-going men that were on the Mayflower signed this compact, and this was really important, not only because it was a successful colony and led to more settlement in New England, but particularly because it allowed the colonists, the Pilgrims, to create a self-governed colony. Everyone that was part of the church and was male had a say in this new government. And so this was really a precedent for what was later established in many of the other colonies, and which later leads to ideas that we take and we put into place in our budding democracy in the early years after we separate from the British. So as you can see, the early settlements that we have here really do lead to a lot of the ideas that we bring into our government, and so therefore it's important for us to look at these and consider why the British decided to settle in this area.